Now, the next topic we're going to get into is our current operations at Oatmeal Lane, our temporary LNG. And I know this is a very important topic to many of you. We've already had some questions coming in regarding said operations. The one thing I'll just I'll highlight before I turn it over to Dan, our director of LNG for the area, to cover this topic is, the future of LNG at Oatmeal Lane is something that we will certainly address in our fourth prepared material line item. So if you have questions about, what's going to be the future, or how long, and those sort of things, you may want to hold off on those questions because we will be addressing, the future and the path forward later on in the prepared materials. But without further ado, let me turn it over to Dan. Dan, it's all yours.
All right, thanks, Brian. Hope you guys can hear me. So yeah, we'll cover at a high level. We're going to cover what LNG is, just very basic definitions, properties of LNG, the benefits, basically why we use it. Then we'll jump into Oatmeal Lane temporary LNG operations for this winter. The purpose for the operation, some of the safety aspects, security that goes into the pre-planning and setting up of the site. So, Mike, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so very basically, what is LNG? Well, it's an acronym. Liquefied natural gas. Basically, what it stands for. It's the liquid form of the lightest hydrocarbons in natural gas. It's predominantly methane. Right, we're talking methane with some constituents of other hydrocarbons, including ethane, propane, and other trace components, but it's predominantly methane. So what are some of the properties of LNG? Well, it's a liquid, right, liquefied natural gas. Well, it's not just any kind of liquid, it's a cryogenic liquid. A cryogenic liquid is basically any gas compound that liquefies at a temperature below 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So if we look to the right, we have a couple different most common cryogenic gases. LNG, as you can see, is actually on the higher end of the temperature scale, the cryogenic temperature scale, at minus 258 degrees. Oxygen is right around minus 300 degrees, followed by nitrogen, hydrogen, and we get down to helium. We're talking pretty cold stuff, minus 454 degrees. So LNG is colorless and odorless. It's non-toxic. Misconception is that the LNG itself is flammable. LNG itself is not flammable. The vapors, LNG vapors, are flammable. It's lighter than air. And again, as I mentioned, it's only flammable in vapor form and within the flammability range. So it needs a very precise concentration with oxygen to be flammable. Okay, moving on to the next slide. All right, so why do we use LNG? So what are the benefits of LNG? Well, it's one of the things is that it's for ease of storage and transport. We can basically fill a tanker ship and ship LNG anywhere across the world. One of the other benefits is its volumetric efficiency. Essentially, one unit of LNG in, let's say, 1 cubic foot of LNG can produce upwards of 600 times its ratio in gas form. So essentially, one cubic foot of LNG produces 600 cubic feet of natural gas. It's practical source of supply in remote locations. So when we're talking Oatmeal Lane and Aquidneck Island, we know we have a supply constraint with natural gas feeding the island. Well, LNG can make up that, can supplement the pipeline capacity. It's also one of the cleanest fossil fuels. And the combustion of natural gas actually does not emit any soot, dust, or fumes, and generates 30% less carbon dioxide than fuel oil and 45% less than coal. It's twofold reduction in nitrogen oxide emissions, NOx, and almost no environmentally damaging sulfur dioxide emission. So basically, the basic properties and behaviors of LNG make it a very desirable fuel option, which can be managed safely. So moving on to the next slide. So the Oatmeal Lane temporary LNG site. So the purpose of the operations, again, we know we have a supply constraint on the island. So LNG comes in as a viable short-term solution to make up that supply constraint. So the primary function is to provide supplemental gas supply to Aquidneck Island when the pipeline supply cannot meet demand. When does that happen? Typically, that happens in the coldest days of the winter. So during high demand days, so some of the coldest days in the winter, the facility will come online and vaporize the stored LNG and inject it into the pipeline, thus shaving the top off the peak. It's called peak shaving. Essentially, the facility is a peak shaving portable site. So the Oatmeal Lane facility operates temporarily and is staged seasonally, which only during the winter months, as you can imagine, when the coldest days can be expected and the pipeline supply cannot meet the demand. So after the winter, the facility is fully demobilized and all LNG equipment is removed from the site once it's no longer needed. As you can imagine, in the warmer months, there's plenty of gas flowing through that LNG is not required. Moving on. Next slide, please. Safety. So when it comes to setting up a site, a portable LNG site like Oatmeal Lane, National Grid has a lot of experience with portable facilities. We've set up portable sites across Massachusetts in the past, including Rhode Island, New Hampshire. There's a lot that goes into setting up a site like that with the understanding of safety concerns, and setting up LNG at a portable site requires a lot of pre-planning. So facility siting evaluations are performed and on a risk-based approach, so risk-based analysis. So it's worth noting that a lot of this is actually performed via the assistance of third-party experts, subject matter experts on process safety management. And some of these risk-based analyses include quantitative risk assessments, QRAs, hazard distance assessments, which help develop evacuation distances, fire protection studies, site-wide process hazard analyses, and layers of protection analyses. And we can move on. Okay, so at the site itself, the equipment is equipped with a lot of mitigative safeguards and independent layers of protections built into the process to ensure safety. There's also fully trained and qualified and certified workforce operating the equipment. Third-party contracted personnel are the people who actually operate the equipment. That's their bread and butter. They operate this type of equipment everywhere across the country. National Grid LNG operations is on site with instrumentation technicians and specialists. Kind of oversee the operation. Management has the overall site management and oversight. And with collaboration with the local first responder agencies, we develop safety protocols and emergency protocols. There's also an assessment of hazard scenarios that's performed. And from all this risk-based approach, we can develop hazard distances and evacuation plans that we collaborate with the first responders of the local areas. And also we conduct very comprehensive site tours and drills with the local first responders to make sure they understand how the equipment works and what the hazards are, so they're familiar with the site and the equipment should they need to respond. Next slide, please. So the other aspect of the operation is obviously the site security. We want to make sure we have secure facility that we can operate, and for that we have fully trained, qualified, certified third-party security force working under the supervision of National Grid Corporate Security. These are security professionals. The security officers on site are there 24/7 upon mobilization of the first LNG equipment. National Grid personnel comes on site 24/7 upon the first LNG delivery. So the equipment is delivered dry, and upon the first delivery of LNG, we have the National Grid experts, technicians, and operators on site to monitor. Contracted personnel come on site anytime the equipment is in operation, and periodically for routine equipment checks, maintenance functions when the equipment is on standby mode, which is most of the time the equipment's actually just in standby mode. We don't need to vaporize, again, unless very cold weather rolls through and we need the supplemental gas. So if you're familiar with the area, you'll know that at a certain point, in the winter season, we'll start to set up the site, and part of that includes security fencing that encompasses the entire perimeter of the site. Part of that access control includes comprehensive access control, locking vehicle gates, and access management through the security officer who's on site. 100% area coverage with the lighting. The security, that lighting that's there is not only for operational needs, but it's also for security purposes. Full visibility of the site, which is very important for the security officer who's patrolling. And also, vehicle control system. So basically, that's a set of barricades to prevent any kind of, accidental. If a vehicle accidentally veers into the fence line to the site, there's a way to prevent the vehicle from making contact with the equipment that's on site. Moving on to the next slide. Here we go. So we'll turn it back over to Brian.